Welcome back to Hackers on Planet Earth 2020, everyone watching around the world. If you'd like to participate, it's not too late. Visit us at hope.net. The tickets are half price as well. We're halfway through the conference. That's the only way you're going to get a chance to ask questions of our next presenter, the Tarquin. Speaking about hackers and the Gnostic tradition, hackers and hacker culture are usually portrayed as being novel, with even the earliest proposed dates for hackers as a cultural group only going back to the 1960s or so. The Tarquin, a Seattle-based hacker researcher, sorry about that. The Tarquin, a Seattle-based hacker security researcher, and most importantly, a philosophy school dropout, will be talking about hacker culture in the light of earlier cultural movements. First, we're going to have a video, and then our speaker, the Tarquin, will be back for Q&A.
Hi, folks. My talk today is entitled Hackers and the Gnostic Tradition. And if I comport myself well, it's going to be somewhere in the middle ground between a talk, a polemic, and a fever dream. Basically, I'm hoping I can land somewhere between sociological dot connecting and arcane rite. We'll see how it goes. But first, about myself. I'm the Tarquin, sometimes known as Aaron Brown. I'm a philosopher. Like a lot of philosophers, I've dropped out of academic philosophy. I'm unusual only in that I've dropped out not once, but twice. I also have a day job. I'm the principal security engineer for a healthcare research company called Evidation Health. I'm very lucky to work with a lot of people who are smarter than me, doing stuff that actually helps make the world a better place. I should note here that I speak only for myself and not at all for my employer. And finally, I'm a hacker. And that's really the part I want to focus on today. Now, being a philosopher is a lot like being a 4-year-old, in that you end up asking why a lot. And I genuinely believe that why is almost always a good and sensible question to ask. So, why am I giving this talk? Well, on one level, I'm giving this talk simply because I think there's a lot of interesting correlations between historic knowledge-centered cultures and modern hacker culture. In particular, I'm going to be talking about the Gnostics of the 1st through the 3rd centuries CE. I'll be spending most of my time talking about how I think the Gnostics in particular had some interesting similarities to hackers, before moving on to talk about the Alchemists of the Renaissance, who were breakers of systems in their own way. Then I'll finally descend into madness and talk about the occultists of the late 19th and early 20th century. Each of these cultures took the pursuit of knowledge and of some kind as a central tenet, and as a result bear some passing resemblance to those of us gathered here today, here being wherever in the world you happen to be gathered. On a more fundamental level, though, I'm hoping to make the case that there are things that hackers can learn from these previous cultures to help us be more true to the hacker spirit and to actually enrich our own culture and our own lives. But finally, I'm trying to encourage you to reflect on and accept that hackers do in fact have a culture, and that our culture is important, a source of value, and worth preserving. I don't think that I'm arguing for any kind of class consciousness here, but I'm definitely trying to argue for cultural awareness. But first, I'd like to open with a reading. This is just an excerpt, but some of you will be familiar with it. I made a discovery today. I found a computer. Wait a second, this is cool. It does what I want it to. If it makes a mistake, it's because I screwed it up, not because it doesn't like me. And then it happened. A door opened to a world, rushing through the phone line like heroin through an addict's veins. An electronic pulse is sent out. A refuge from the day-to-day incompetencies is sought. A board is found. This is it. This is where I belong. I know everyone here, even if I've never met them, never talked to them, may never hear from them again. I know you all. Damn kid, tying up the phone line again. They're all alike. You bet your ass we're all alike. We've been spoon-fed baby food at school when we hungered for steak. The bits of meat that you did let slip through were pre-chewed and tasteless. We've been dominated by sadists or ignored by the apathetic. The few that had something to teach us found willing pupils, but those few are like drops of water in the desert. This is our world now, the world of the electron and the switch, the beauty of the bod. We make use of a service already existing without paying for it, for what could be dirt cheap if it wasn't run by profiteering gluttons, and you call us criminals. We explore, and you call us criminals. We seek after knowledge, and you call us criminals. We exist without skin color, without nationality, without religious bias, and you call us criminals. You build atomic bombs, you wage wars, you murder, cheat, and lie to us, and try to make us believe it's for our own good, yet we're the criminals. Yes, I'm a criminal. My crime is that of curiosity. My crime is that of judging people by what they say and think, not what they look like. My crime is that of outsmarting you, something that you will never forgive me for. Now, if we were in person, here's where I would ask for an amen. The Conscience of a Hacker, which is a text I think a lot of us are at least passingly familiar with, I think speaks to the Gnostic connection I want to talk about today. And in part, it's because it speaks to that connection because all cultures have a set of stories that they tell about themselves. So if we're going to be talking about hacker culture, we should understand the story that we tell ourselves about that culture. And especially, we should understand the story that we tell ourselves about the history of hacker culture. I'm going to give you an abbreviated version of it before we jump way back in the past. Now, the story that many of us carry around about hackers looks something like this. In the midst of prehistory, 70 or so years ago, there were some bored, mischievous kids at MIT. Then it was the early 1970s and some folks were whistling down phone lines for free calls. Then in the late 1980s, everyone went to jail for a while. And now we all live in a William Gibson novel and all of us work in InfoSec. Now, of course, this is a pretty impoverished view of hacker history. But like I said, it's the one that most of us are kind of operating with. Especially younger generations of hackers are walking around with roughly this level of understanding in their heads. Now that's not really, or at least not entirely their fault, but unpacking why would be a completely own talk on its own. And I'm not really here to give you a history of hackers. What I'm here is to give you, in a sense, a prehistory. I'm here to see if we can look at other similar cultures throughout the history of the world and learn something from them that might inform our world today. But first, I want to do another reading. This reading is from a Gnostic gospel called the Apocryphon of John. The teaching of the Savior and the revelation of the mysteries and the things hidden in silence. For the perfection is majestic. He is pure, immeasurable mind. He is knowledge-giving knowledge. And I said, Lord, those who have not known to whom they belong, where will their souls be? And he said to me, in those, the despicable spirit has gained strength when they went astray, and he burdens the soul and draws it to the works of evil, and he casts it down into forgetfulness. They bind it with chains and cast it into prison, and consort with it until it is liberated from the forgetfulness and acquires knowledge. And if thus it becomes perfect, it is saved. Gnosticism, the name of which comes from the Greek gnosis, meaning to know. You can think of like agnostic as kind of a similar etymology. It describes a set of religious beliefs that arose in the Middle East starting around the 2nd century BCE and flourishing into the early era of Christianity as an alternative and heretical understanding of the Judeo-Christian faith. In Gnosticism, the God that created the world is not one to be worshipped, but rather a tyrannical warden who created the earth as a prison. This God, who is known as the Demiurge, or by the name Yaldabaoth, created the world to capture souls and to imprison them in bodies of flesh, stuck in a broken and fallen world. The Gnostics understood knowledge as the only way to escape this prison. They taught that when one died, their soul would ascend toward the source of all light and wisdom, which was the soul's home before being trapped on earth. In order to make this ascent, however, they'd have to pass by 7 guardians, the children of the Demiurge, known as the Archons. In order to pass each Archon, the soul would need to have the right knowledge in order to avoid their detection or to pass their challenge. In Gnostic mythology, knowledge is often depicted as a shining pearl or jewel, and one consistent metaphor used is of a soul being sent to steal it from the evil of the world and carrying it back up through these Archons to the source. This model of knowledge as a source of salvation leads to some interesting parallels with hacker culture. Here's another reading, this one from the Gnostic work on the origins of the world. The tree of knowledge is endowed with the power of God. It is glorious as the moon shining brightly, and its branches are lovely. Its leaves are like fig leaves, and its fruit is like a bunch of good, delicious dates. You are the tree of knowledge which is in paradise, from which the first man ate. For the Gnostics, knowledge was not only a utilitarian good, but a moral good as well. Teaching, learning, and the uncovering of hidden truth was all seen as the only way to transcend our earthly world, and was understood to prepare the soul for the arduous journey to face the Archons in the afterlife. Wisdom was also seen by some Gnostics as the root of virtue in this world, and those who were kinder, more just, and more faithful were so because they possessed more of the sacred knowledge. My central contention in this talk is that hackers, whether they realize it or not, treat knowledge in a similarly moralized way. Knowledge for hackers is what Charles Taylor would call a hypergood, that is, a thing by which other things derive their goodness. So in this case, things are good in proportion to how much they help us learn new knowledge, or bad in proportion to how much they prevent learning. Every time a hacker fights against censorship, open sources their code, shares their hacks far and wide, or, shall we say, liberates information out of a sense of duty, they're participating in the same kind of belief of knowledge as a moral good, and the restriction of knowledge, conversely, as an evil. Another reading, this one from the Secret Book of John. The human being Adam was revealed through the bright shadow within, and Adam's ability to think was greater than that of all the creators. When they looked up, they saw that Adam's ability to think was greater, and they devised a plan with the whole throng of Archons and angels. They took fire, earth, and water, and combined them with the 4 fiery winds. They wrought them together and made a great commotion. Unfortunately for the Gnostics, their pursuit of knowledge was contested by adversaries in both this world and the next, who wanted to keep humanity in the dark. In the afterlife, as I've mentioned, the Gnostics had to contend with the Archons and the Demiurge, who wanted to keep them ignorant and so imprisoned. In this world, the Gnostics had to contend with the religious establishment, who decried as heretical the belief that the God of this world was an evil to be transcended, and the belief that knowledge was more important than the grace bestowed by priests. I want to emphasize here that the Gnostics were right to be afraid of the forces that wanted to erase their knowledge. Gnostic scriptures and teachings were almost entirely wiped out by the end of the 4th century AD. In fact, a huge amount of what we know about Gnosticism comes from a single archaeological find at Nag Hammadi in Egypt. The codices found there were probably buried by one or more devoted Gnostics at the end of the 4th century, and they contained 52 books that would have been considered heretical under the Christian reforms of that era. They were uncovered by grave robbers in the 1940s and translated and published throughout the following few decades. A full English translation was not available until the late 1970s. So that's 1,500 years during which there was only scarce fragments of Gnostic knowledge left over. And while hackers' adversaries today are purely secular, there are still those that would rather the knowledge hackers discover be suppressed. We see this every time a hacker gets a cease and desist for telling you how to repair or modify your devices. We see it every time a hacker gets threatened with a CFAA violation for reporting a security vulnerability. We see it with legislation that threatens our freedom for building systems that offer end-to-end encryption. So while you may not believe in Archons guarding the way to the source of all life, hoping to trap ignorant souls after death, there are most certainly Archons in this world that seek to prevent us from learning and sharing our knowledge. And while technology makes it harder for us to end up like the Gnostics, we should take seriously the idea that someday Tor and the Internet Archive might be something like our Nag Hammadi. A final Gnostic reading, this one from the Book of Thomas. The Savior said, "All bodies have come into being in the same irrational way that animals are produced. Those that are above, however, do not exist like us. Rather, they live from their own root, and their crops nourish them. But we feed on creatures that are like us, and so our bodies are subject to change. Whatever is subject to change will perish and be lost." Another interesting corollary between Gnostics and hackers is a devaluation of the physical world. Hackers will sometimes refer to the physical world as Meatspace. We tend to invest a lot more time and energy into our digital lives and work than into our corporeal equivalents. A whole branch of our humor revolves around the fact that we don't take the best care of our bodies, and we need to be regularly reminded of the 3-2-1 rule. Even the reading from The Conscience of a Hacker that I opened this talk with created a clear delineation between the boring, oppressive physical world and the liberatory digital one. Many of us, myself included, identify as transhumanists, and at best we see our physical form as something to be tinkered with and improved, the same way we would any other system. Our biohacking siblings are in a strange way both the epitome of this and also kind of the exception to it. Only by treating the body as just another system, as raw material, not at all sacred in any way, does it make sense to engage in biohacking. Now, I fully admit that I myself am running completely stock, unhacked, closed-source human biology 1.0, so perhaps some of the grinders in the audience could have a better perspective on this. If you do, please get in touch. I'd love to hear more about your views and talk about this in depth. So, the Gnostics were one of the first knowledge-seeking cults, but they were far from the only ones. I want to touch on two other ones to draw at least a hint of a historical through line. Fast forwarding 1,000 years, we end up with the Alchemists. Today, we mostly think of alchemy as a kind of proto-chemistry, but that's really doing a disservice to it and downplaying how weird and cool it actually was. The Alchemists, like the Gnostics, saw knowledge not only as a utilitarian good, but as something akin to a means of salvation. While the alchemical connection to morality was, I think, more muddied than in the Gnostics, the one piece of the puzzle that the alchemists gave us was in thinking of things in terms of systems. One reason the alchemists were seen as proto-scientists is that they sought to build a grand, unified understanding of the system of the universe. And while alchemy started in the Arabic world, the term comes almost directly from the Arabic alchemia, meaning the transmutation of metals, this systematization really became the central focus during the late Middle Ages and the Renaissance in Europe. Alchemists developed their own elemental table of sorts. Hackers will be happy to hear that ethanol was considered a primary element. They also created elaborate charts of the motion of the heavens, detailed, if inaccurate, models of the workings of the human body, and much more. They thought of it all as one integrated system with elaborate interconnections. And of course, they sought to cheat that system. Alchemists spent years trying to find hacks that would let them turn one kind of element into another, ways to rewire the unmaintainable and hard to upgrade system of human biology to remove that annoying planned obsolescence called aging, and even sought ways to glitch out of reality entirely. They were basically trying to find a speedrun cheat to get to heaven quicker. Their view of the world was as that of an integrated system, which led them to seek ways to bend that system to their will. These ranged from the abstract, legalistic, pseudo-magical Faust, who, sought to write contracts with demons, to the more practical experimentation of the Egyptian alchemist Agathodamon, who mostly spent his time fucking around with arsenic and probably got more than a few people killed because of it. Along the way, they managed to invent gunpowder in China, advanced alcohol distillation and purification in Europe, and more importantly, to fix in the human psyche that there was a comprehensible, all-encompassing system to reality, and that that system could be hacked. Moving ahead a little bit more is where we get to really just kick this whole knowledge cult thing straight off the rails. Starting the late 18th century and progressing right up until the present, Gnostic mysticism, alchemical systematizing, Catholic mysteries, and a mixture of mythologies coalesced into the fevered brains of a few luminaries, who then created a collection of esoteric beliefs that all get broadly lumped together as the occult. They basically took the knowledge as salvation model of the Gnostics, the systematizing of the Hermetic Alchemists, and the understanding that you can get people to believe just about anything if you really nail the aesthetics. And they created a dizzying array of cults all centered around the notion of being the heirs to secret magical knowledge. One of the most influential of these groups was the Rosicrucians. Now, I like to think of the Rosicrucians a bit like Anonymous, in that years after they did their best work, everyone started claiming to have been a member, and a bunch of subgroups splintered off, all claiming to be true heirs to the original. What these groups have in common is that they all claim to possess hidden knowledge. They have a heavy focus on symbolism and aesthetics, and at least the best of them seem like they're having a wild time. Puzzles and ciphers are a common feature, as are wild parties in which they initiate one another into secrets and perform magical rites. Many of the books they produce are these extremely beautifully over-the-top decorated tomes that are essentially one long crypto CTF with probably no answer. They're pretty great. One common theme that runs through all the groups I've spoken about, including the Gnostics, the Alchemists, and now the Occultists, is the taking of new names. As one example, the Hermetic branch of occultism takes its name from Hermes Trismegistus, or Hermes the Thrice Great. Hermes Trismegistus wrote some of the founding texts that were revived in modern times to form the basis of some of these occult groups. Now, that of course was almost certainly not his real name, and many of the other occult writers and practitioners followed suit, taking on grandiose or important-sounding handles themselves. And while hacker handles came about more as a way to ensure anonymity than to impress cult followers, it's not by accident that most hackers choose names that are either aesthetically significant to them or aspirational in some way. Occult groups usually organized elaborate rites of induction and tests of knowledge for their adherents. Most had strict levels that could only be attained after demonstrating proper knowledge of the hidden teachings and magical techniques taught by the cult. And while the rites of passage or induction for hackers are significantly looser, which is a good thing, fuck gatekeeping, that in some way makes them more significant. The black badge competitions at DEF CON might be considered something like a hacker rite. They're demonstrations of applied knowledge that only an elect few can accomplish, which are then recognized by the community with honors and accolades. CTFs might be another example of testing the skills and knowledge that exist only in hacker circles and not in the rest of the world. These tests then are used for bragging rights or for other kinds of community accolades. And while it's true that we don't bestow rank and title onto hackers who pass these tests, I do think there's some real similarities between declaring someone adeptus exemptus of the Societas Rosicruciana and saying something like, yo, that person won the demo competition at Assembly. Also, like hackers, the occultists, as well as many modern witches, neo-pagans, and their cultic groups, often operate in small, close-knit circles. And this makes a lot of sense if you're a group of like-minded individuals whose pursuit of the truth is out of step with the broader culture around you, and if you're learning from and teaching one another. I genuinely believe that some of the social and intellectual forces behind groups like Loft Heavy Industries or the Legion of Doom are the same as those that kind of animate the Ordo Templi Orientis or the Hermetic Order of the Golden Dawn. Both sets were groups of people seeking knowledge together in a way that wasn't accepted or understood by those around them. I guess what I'm saying is, it's not by accident that it's the cult of the dead cow. But most of all, the thing I think is the most similar between hackers and the occult is the sense of play involved in both. Like, the Gnostics were trying to get to heaven. That I understand. The Alchemists were trying to change the world. That's noble. The occultists and witches and various modern magi are just trying to do some fucking magic. And they seem to consistently enjoy the chaos and the fun that goes along with it. And that to me is my favorite part of hacking. The intoxicating sense of mischief and chaos that goes along with it. It's honestly the reason why I'm desperately missing the in-person Hope this year. I'm missing all of my fellow hackers and making weird techno magic with all of you. And if I can say, I'm hoping you're all having a wonderful time and a wonderful conference wherever you are in the world. And I hope in 2 years' time we get to do this in person again. And so I want to close out this kind of historical wander through knowledge cults and cultures with a quote from my favorite witch, Pixie Coleman Smith. That's a picture of her. Now, Pixie Coleman Smith was a witch and a theatrical artist and a visual artist and just a really all-around interesting character who led a fascinating life. And this is a quote from her writings on art that I think can actually serve hackers as well as it does artists or witches. Banish fear. Brace your courage. Place your ideal high up with the sun, away from the dirt and squalor and ugliness around you. And let that power that makes the roar of the high power presses enter into your work. Energy, courage, life, love. Use your wits. Use your eyes. Perhaps you use your physical eyes too much and see only the mask. Find eyes within. Look for the door into the unknown country. As I said in the beginning, this overview I've just given is mostly to draw some parallels and hopefully get you thinking about what aspects of these previous cultures we hackers might share. But I also want to take seriously the idea that in learning from them, we can inform and strengthen our own culture. Because first and foremost, hackers do have a culture, and that culture matters. Now, I fully acknowledge that giving this talk at Hope, I'm probably somewhat preaching to the converted, but there are many hackers out there for whom the idea of a hacker culture is just kind of like line noise. And I think that's a real shame. And if you've been to like a DEF CON recently or any of those other large hacker conventions, I'm sure you've met some of these people that don't understand there's a hacker culture out there they could be participating in and contributing to. And it's important, I think, that we make the case for it because a healthy hacker culture can inform our work, our art, and our lives. It can help us all survive in a world where there are Archons that see our curiosity and our tinkering as a threat. It can help us understand the systems around us and how they can be broken. And maybe most importantly, it can help us have a hell of a lot more fun doing it. Like I said at the start, I don't think I'm advocating for any kind of like hacker class consciousness here, but I am advocating for us all to take seriously the idea that we are part of something like a knowledge cult. And it behooves us to take care of our culture and to stand up for it. Because as a culture, we have art that's worth making and experiencing. And it's art that only hackers can make, right? Radio Wonderland and Agrippa, the Book of the Dead, are things that only hackers could create. And it's in part because of that fact that only hackers can make this art that makes it significant and important and worth sharing with the world. We have myths that give us common stories and points of reference. And for hackers, those stories, those myths usually revolve around the discovery of hidden knowledge and the use of that knowledge to change society. Sometimes for the better and sometimes for the different and more complicated. We have heroes who have made not only our culture, but the whole world a better place because of their belief in the value of knowledge and their courage to stand up against Archons. And finally, we have martyrs. We have hackers who have lost their lives, who've been destroyed because they sought to bring knowledge to the world. Because, like all of us, they were in some sense animated by that Gnostic spirit, and that belief that knowledge is not just about what it empowers us to do, but who it empowers us to be. They were animated by a belief that knowledge was morally important. And if you accept my premise that hackers understand knowledge as having moral value, then there are, of course, ethical implications as well. If you take seriously the notion that, like I said, knowledge is important not just for what it allows us to do, but for who it allows us to be, then that points us towards an ethic of openness and education, one of mentoring and sharing of our knowledge. It points towards an ethic that is inclusive of all people, regardless of their race, sex, sexuality, gender identity, or disability. It points towards an ethic that transcends the borders drawn by Archons and recognizes them for the arbitrary lines that they are. It points towards an ethic that is, at the very least, skeptical of power structures, knowing that any nation, church, or corporation, no matter how fond we might be of it today, may be the Archon trying to stamp us out tomorrow. If I'm right, and hacker culture is one in which knowledge is elevated to a moral good, then we must welcome anyone who wants to learn and must do our best to teach. And we must reject and stand against any force that would prevent us from doing so. I covered a lot of ground in this talk, and I can only hope that some of it was at least of interest. I certainly hope I made the case that the Gnostics' knowledge-centered morality, the Alchemists' systematizing, and the occultist sense of fun and chaos all have some kind of echoes in hacker culture today. So I do hope that I participated in that and that I taught and helped you to learn. But failing that, I hope I at least got you to think about the role that knowledge and learning play for hackers, and to entertain the notion that they might be central to a culture that's worth fostering and preserving. Because if we don't take our culture seriously, someday all of the knowledge that we gather may end up having to be squirreled away in a digital Nag Hammadi to be rediscovered by some far future generation. Rediscovered, that is, if we're lucky. So I'd like to take a moment to send some greetings to people who've taught me and from whom I've learned a great deal. First of all, my crew, the additional payphones, Dirac Delta, Cyber, Cobels, Turbo, Giscard, and Forcad. They always have my back, and I cannot begin to tell you how much I've learned from all of them. I'd like to thank my friend and mentor, Father Tim Clancy, who helped me kind of sharpen my understanding and ideas about the Gnostics, and who kind of gave me a lot of advice when I was putting this talk together back in the early days, kind of like formalizing these thoughts. And then finally, I'd like to thank Dr. Kirk Besmer, my grad school advisor. Sorry for bailing, but thank you for teaching. And thank you all so much for listening. I'm very reachable on all the normal channels that folks use. Please do reach out to me if you want to talk about this more. But for now, we'll just turn it over to questions. Thank you all so very much.
And we are back with the Tarquin. That was a great video. Thank you for preparing your presentation for us. A lot of conversation has been going on in the chat. It's been very active. So obviously we do have a few questions. Again, the best way to ask questions is to put them in the Q&A live stream channel on our Matrix instance. So one comment that I had highlighted was that what you were talking about as the future was the future once upon a time.
Yes. It's funny how the future has a way of changing out from under you. And I think it's interesting, especially given with COVID, I think that this arc that we kind of see ourselves on has changed. And one of the things I've been really impressed with is the extent to which hackers have risen to the challenge presented. I have a very good friend in Portland who he went from working on side projects and kind of just doing his own thing, to all of a sudden he and his maker buddies, they were getting like Oregon State health approved like PPE into field hospitals and into hospitals to treat folks. I think within a couple of weeks of starting the project, right? We've seen, I mean, hell, not to blow too much smoke, but the people who put on Hope this year have done an incredible logistical miracle getting this all together. And so I think in some sense, it's been interesting to see how quickly the future can change. But really, I think what we can learn from it is if you get a bunch of people together who spend a lot of time thinking about creative ways to subvert systems and solve problems, in a way, we're highly resilient to things like plagues or any kind of crisis that might deviate our path to the future. So.
Yeah, there's a good metaphysical question in the chat that I just popped up. Should we try and ignore and evade the Archons of this world, or disclose the truth and possibly end up in prison or outcast to some remote land?
That's a fantastic question, and it's one that I don't think there is a clear answer to. I mean, the Gnostics had the same question back in their day, right? There were Gnostics who were, persecuted by the church. And there were Gnostics like the priest at Nag Hammadi, who their response was not to stand up necessarily, but to realize that they could not win and to squirrel away that knowledge for the future. I'm not going to stand up here and demand that everyone be a warrior against the Archons. I'm not going to stand up here and say that everyone should be, Edward Snowden or, God forbid, Aaron Schwartz. What I am going to do is say that you should take seriously the idea that there are Archons out there. And I use that metaphor, I use it in a pretty broad sense. And I think that, I have constraints in my own life that prevent me from being, quite the ideological firebrand I would like to sometimes. But I think it's a question we often ask for ourselves. But one of the questions of philosophy, is what ought we to do? And the way you start that is to have an ethic. And I think that a great way to start building an ethic and to understand what you ought to do in a situation is to take seriously the idea that your life as a hacker can inform that, and that there are certain ethical components to being a hacker that we don't get to ignore. And that might help you answer that question for yourself.
Speaking of ethics, do you see a single quote unquote hacker ethic? Are there many different hacker ethics, or perhaps it's down to individual hackers' ethical codes?
Yeah, I think that's a great question. I think of it a little bit like a tree with a common trunk. There are roots of a hacker ethic, right? And I think that one of the things that helps us come together is that fact. Now, there are people who might disagree at the margins, but I think that core of, like I said, anyone who wants to come and participate should be welcome. Like, it must be a welcoming environment, right? That skepticism of power structures that might tell us to think in a certain way, right? Or that certain kinds of exploration and thought are out of bounds, right? So for me, I think that there is a strong central core of a hacker ethic, and that people can disagree at the margins, but I do think that there is a lot of commonality. So not to try and thread the eye of the needle too much on this question. I think there is a common hacker ethic that we all share. And from that root, 1,000 individual understandings of how to implement that ethic might grow. But I think there is a lot of commonality, and it all comes down to that freedom of information, teaching, sharing, and that we're all in this same kind of pursuit together.
And just feeding back into a couple of the themes that I noticed. Now, you mentioned, for instance, that you believe that the hacker ethic has a common root. You mentioned, for example, that alchemy has its root in the Arab world. Similarly, a lot of modern hacking has roots in the US and Western context. Alchemy shifted when it spread beyond its roots in the Maghreb. Now, what shifts or changes has hacking experienced in those cultural shifts?
Oh, that's a fantastic question. I would say, I would challenge the question a little bit and say that our understanding of hackers as coming from America and Europe predominantly is a little bit of an effect of the American hegemony and the fact that if you see something in media, you see the American version first and most prominently, right? And so, I joked about the story that we tell ourselves as being like MIT, whistling down phone lines, prison, InfoSec. But that is if anyone has an idea of hackers, that is a big part of it. They might throw in the movie Hackers there, maybe Sneakers. But you'll notice that a lot of that is because those are American institutions, and so they are given more attention and they've got a broader reach. And so I would strongly suggest that we look at a lot of hackers elsewhere in the world that have been doing this for years. A book I love, and I've been talking to anyone who will listen, is Jace Clayton's book, Uproot. And he talks about actually a lot of different kind of almost folk music traditions across the world that have been empowered by computers. And the idea that, they've taken this really weird flexible machine and used it to lift their traditions and their culture up into the modern world, right? And this idea that the computer can be a folk instrument. And he talks about people in Mexico, in the Maghreb, other places, in sub-Saharan Africa. And those are hackers that have been doing this for as long as hackers in the West have. They just haven't had the visibility, right? So to answer the second part of that question, I think that we can absolutely see hacker strains out there in the world. And while I think that there's been things like, DEF CON China, people are understandably extremely conflicted about moving this hacker conference into a regime that's fairly totalitarian, right? I say fairly, it's totalitarian. I'm not going to go to Beijing anytime soon. I feel safe saying that. But reaching out and finding ways to include people in the broader global hacker culture, I think is good. We've seen actually the hacker ideas from some of the ways that the protesters in Hong Kong dealt with, or engaged in protest, come back over here, right? The use of umbrella shield walls is a brilliant, simple idea that has kind of a whimsical hacker heart to it, I think, right? The fact that they realize that, oh, hey, snowblowers can be pretty effective against tear gas, right? So these aren't hacking in the traditional sense, but I think there's a kind of common idea there, and that there is a lot of cross-pollination that's happening. And I firmly believe that we should be looking at hacker groups in the global South, South America, things like that. They have a lot to teach us. And I think that if we realize that, a huge part of our vision of hackers globally is just that the first, the brightest light you see in any topic when you look at it is whatever the American culture kind of portrays about that. I think that you will get around it and you will find hackers in a lot of places that you did not see before. I hope that answered your question. It was a bit of a ramble.
No, yeah, I mean, I understand that one because it's a bit of a deeper question. And now, again, this is content that is deep and challenging. Can you suggest some simpler or perhaps easier to process starting points, even for how to have these conversations amongst fellow hackers or with people that we know that aren't part of the hacker community?
Yeah, that's a question that's a little hard for me to answer because I've been reading a lot about this, especially like recently in preparing this talk. One fairly accessible, though scholarly, kind of dense work is the work of Hans Jonas. He wrote probably the seminal text on the modern understanding of Gnosticism. It's called The Gnostic Religion, The Message of the Alien God and the Beginnings of Christianity. His writing style is very accessible, but it is one of those things that will get, you'll get more information than you want, right? I also think that the Nag Hammadi library, there's an excellent English translation of all the texts that were found at Nag Hammadi. If you want to go right to the sources, the translation for those into English is excellent. There's also translations into German and Italian, and if there's language that is more comfortable for you, there are some other translations out there. I would also suggest, for some of the kind of occult and alchemical stuff, the occult works are actually intentionally hard to access, right? The whole point of the occult is that it's there are mysteries there, right? In fact, if I had to highlight one of the biggest differences between hackers and occultists, it's that occultists want, in some sense, to have their knowledge be privileged. But I would say, go and read some of the writings of kind of people associated with it, right? Go and read Aleister Crowley. It gets weird, and you'll read a lot about sex magic and probably have some really uncomfortable passages to read. But it gives you a sense of what they're trying to do. They're trying to change the world via this lens of kind of mystical aesthetics,
Yeah, that's a pretty cool contrast, though, between the secret world of some of these ancient groups and the openness, relatively speaking, at least, of the hacker community, such as through events like the one we're presenting now.
Yeah.
And honestly, I wouldn't have thought of connecting alchemists and hackers the way you have. I'm kind of curious how you view some other organizations, both historical and current, such as the Dionysian mystery cults back in ancient times, the Freemasons, the Rosicrucians. Do you see them having outlooks that are perhaps hacker adjacent?
Yeah, for sure. And I think that, the mystery cults, again, there's that weird sense of, in a way, there's two ways to respond when you think you have a secret, right? One is to hoard it and be precious about it and be like, I have this secret and I'll tell it to you if you cross my palm, or if you do what I say. And that's kind of the mystery cult idea, is that there is some sort of like secret knowledge here, and we'll let you in if it's right for us, right? Or if you're worthy. And then there's the other of like, I have a secret and I want to tell everybody. And that, I think, is the more hacker impulse, right? I think where Gnostics kind of bridged that gap is they did want to teach, and they did want to share that information. And they were secretive only because there was very real risk in sharing that information, right? Awful lot of Gnostics were burned at the stake, right? Or tortured horribly, right? And so I think that there are a lot of hacker adjacent cultures that they saw knowledge as a practical good, right? I have a secret that can get you ahead in life, right? The Freemasons, the reason you join Freemasonry is not actually to learn secrets. It's to learn the secret handshake that introduces you to people in the doors of power, right? They're a secret society first and kind of a knowledge cult second. Whereas the reason why you are a Gnostic is because you feel that knowledge has moral power, right? That's, I think, the delineation that I think is really significant. Do you see knowledge as good only for what it can bring you? Or do you see knowledge as a source of moral truth and value and a foundation on which to build ethics?
Also, I'm just wondering if you could summarize quickly a difference between, say, an occult tradition and a religion. Are there religions that feed into your ideas of hacker ethics?
Yeah, I mean, absolutely. It's not by accident that I thanked Father Tim Clancy then in my talk. Father Tim is a scholar who works on how religions are experienced by people in a technological world, right? He's done some really cool stuff in talking about like, why are mega churches so compelling? And part of it is they're meeting people at the technological boundary where they live, right? Mega churches are very popular with young people because you can get it on your phone, right? You can attend church via Skype and things like that. And so I think there are religious orders today that are very hacker-like. I actually think a lot of the Jesuits are, right? I went to a Jesuit university. And so they're this weird little offshoot of Catholicism that takes as their mission, their charism, their calling, education, right? They are called to teach. And they see teaching and knowledge and the pursuit of information and education as a way to get closer to God and as a service that one does to God and the church, right? Now, I'm not religious myself, but I found myself extremely comfortable amongst Jesuits and amongst the Jesuit education. And I think part of it is that shared kind of educational DNA of education and knowledge as being morally significant for both myself as a hacker and them as a Jesuit. As for the difference between an occult group and a religion, I mean, the glib, snarky answer is, do they get a tax break? Right? There's some level of social acceptance that makes you a religion. I would say there is something a little bit deeper, and one of them is religions tend to focus on some sort of global truth that they see as metaphysical and underlying the world. And occults are much more about aesthetics and kind of the mystical and unexplainable, right? I don't think that's a 100% accurate delineation, but I don't think there is one. So,
No, and I understand. I mean, there's a lot of great conversation in the Matrix chat. Will you be willing to join folks in the hallway conversation room to discuss more about this?
Yes, absolutely. I'm going to take a 2-minute break to attend to my meat robot, and then I'll be there. So,
Tarquin, thank you very much for your presentation at Hope 2020. Can't wait to see you, hopefully the next time we meet in person.
it'd be a pleasure. Thank you so much for having me.
Ground control, take it away.